see this?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now we are recording. Perfect. So as I said, this is the very first HYPIA Research seminar, and the title is Who or What is a Hyperpolyglot? And the assigned readings are there. We will typically have 2 to 3 assigned readings per meeting. And so without further ado, we'll start. I just want to make sure that everybody is in here. Ruben, are you there?
Mm-hmm.
All right, welcome. So there are 3 parts to this meeting. The first one is the presentation on the topic, then there is a debate, and then we decide what the next topic is going to be about. So let's begin with the presentation on the topic. I'm going to basically summarize the main points of each of the readings that we had, and then make some questions that are going to be suggestions. You may or may not choose to touch up on this. That it's entirely on you. So the first reading was Who is a Hyperpolyglot, right? By the one and only Dr. Usman Shohan, the president of HYPIA. And so I would summarize the paper for the purpose of this presentation, meaning there are more points, but I think that these are the main relevant ones for the purpose of this presentation, right? So he discusses the origin, the nature, and the cutoff of what a hyperpolyglot is. So the origin is basically a new term. Hyperpolyglot is a new term for an old reality. Throughout history, we've heard chronicles of Cleopatra, Mezzofanti, Leibniz, etc., being able to speak dozens of languages. And that's what a hyperpolyglot is. The term has been recently popularized by Erhard and Hudson. And essentially what a hyperpolyglot is someone whose polyglot skill has been honed over time to reach a lot of languages. But it's not an exotic gift. It's not a supernatural ability, even though some authors have tried to fetishize or to make this exotic, the label of hyperpolyglot. And it's more common than it seems, even though prima facie people will be tempted to think that speaking 6 or more languages is very rare. It's actually fairly common in global terms, right? So it's more common than it seems. Again, de-fetishizing what a hyperpolyglot is. Welcome, Matthias. We're just presenting the introductory readings.
Sure. For me, it's a great honor.
Thank you. And finally, the cutoff, one of the topics that Dr. Usman discusses, and I do not entirely agree with his cutoff, but I think it's important to discuss it, is how many languages define a hyperpolyglot, right? So this is a contested issue. Some authors have contended 10, 12, 20, and Usman contends that 6 languages minimum, meaning 6 or more, is the perfect spot, the sweet spot. Why? Because we are trying to measure 2 things: how deliberate we are with learning languages and how inclusive we are. So what distinguishes a polyglot from a multilingual person is that the multilingual person happens to speak those languages as a result of his, her upbringing and education, whereas a polyglot has made a deliberate effort to learn those languages. It's a serial language learner, right? So a hyperpolyglot is the same as a polyglot, a serial language learner, but even more on steroids, right? And so how many languages? So if you say 10 or 12, it feels too exclusive in the sense that it feels elitist and many people will be left outside that. But if you say 5 or 4, is that really a lot of serial language learning on a deliberate basis? It's harder to assess, whereas 6 looks like it's impossible to reach fluency in 6 languages without being deliberate and passionate about learning languages, right? So that's why 6 languages as opposed to any other number. And as you know, HYPIA uses a 24-point system, and we can discuss this later on in the conversation. So that's the first reading, okay? Now we're going to go to the second reading. In the second reading, which is my video on multilingual versus polyglot versus hyperpolyglot, I draw upon a lot of the features that Dr. Usman already discussed in his paper. So here I have just summarized new information that was not already there in Usman's paper. So the first, the origin, right? As I said, hyperpolyglot draws upon polyglot, and what distinguishes the polyglot from the multilingual person is how deliberate they are in the accumulation of languages and how that accumulation is driven by passion and curiosity. It's something that defines part of our identity, our passion about languages, right? That's what characterizes a lot of polyglots. In terms of what is a polyglot, it's a combination of favorable genetic predispositions plus this highly deliberate, highly consistent effort. Again, there has to be a certain level of talent, but this is not to fetishicize hyperpolyglots and say, oh, you just have a magical gift out of nowhere. Obviously, for that to come into fruition, you need to be very deliberate and very consistent in your efforts. So I always like to quote this citation from Erhard that says, hyperpolyglots are not born, they are not made, but they are born to be made, which summarizes this combination of genetic predisposition and effort. And the cutoff, I think it should be 10 plus languages. That to me seems to characterize what a hyperpolyglot is as opposed to a polyglot. I understand that inclusivity is key to HYPIA, but when it comes to discussing hyperpolyglossia outside of HYPIA as a concept, as an abstract concept, I think that values, or I'm not sure that values should determine how many languages count as being a hyperpolyglot. I think that it should be linguistic ability, ridden of values, ridden of inclusivity or any other positive value. It doesn't matter how positive that value is. I think that for the purpose of defining who counts as a hyperpolyglot, only linguistic ability should be assessed. At the end of the day, history is full of multilingual people and polyglots who did not necessarily share positive values about multilingualism, right? There were a lot of dictatorships and people who were intolerant, who are able to speak a lot of languages and learn them serially with a purpose in mind, right? And we're passionate about languages, but that doesn't necessarily committed them to those values. So that's my main disagreement with Dr. Usman. Should values affect your judgment of who should be a hyperpolyglot? Yes or no? And we can discuss this later. And then there are a lot of objections to the notion of hyperpolyglot. Sometimes we take it for granted with what a hyperpolyglot is, but it's very problematic. So what are my objections? Basically, it's hard to count languages. Languages are not autonomous, discrete entities. Languages are related in a continuum a lot of times. So it's hard to determine when one language starts, when the other one ends, right? We all know the cases of Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, etc. What counts as one language and the other? And it's always over-determined by political and social factors, right? Changes in government, etc. The second point is that it's hard to measure fluency. And what a person considers to be fluency may not be shared by another person. And then what counts as being fluent in one language is discretionary at the end of the day. There's a certain margin for discretion. Again, what counts as a language and a dialect? For instance, I speak Spanish and Judeo-Spanish. Many people contend that Judeo-Spanish is a dialect of Spanish. I think there are strong arguments against that idea, but then again, it's a contested idea, right? So do I speak Spanish and a dialect of it, or do I speak two languages? And finally, there's the idea that numbers do not tell the whole story. If you speak 10 languages, but 8 of them are from the same family, say Romance languages, are you more of a hyperpolyglot than someone who speaks 6 languages that are pretty much unrelated, say Japanese, Arabic, Russian, Spanish, right? And so that's why Richard Simcott said in the quote that you can see at the bottom, counting languages is a false standard, and one that gets raised ironically mostly by people who don't speak more than one language, by monoglots, Americans in particular. So let's just say that I have studied more than 50 and I use about half of them. So when Simcott is asked how many languages do you speak, he doesn't say 5 or 6 or 10. He says, well, I've studied around 50 and I use half of them, because he doesn't believe in the idea that you can count languages like you can count beers. They are not discrete autonomous entities. And finally, I think it's important to distinguish between the strategic and the vocational use of the label hyperpolyglot. So when I use hyperpolyglot for my YouTube channel or here, I use it strategically, meaning being aware of its limitations, being aware that hyperpolyglot is not an entirely objective category because you cannot count languages, because you cannot distinguish neatly between languages and dialects, etc. And so I think as long as you are aware of that, of the shortcomings of the label hyperpolyglot, you can use it and you should use it because it also attracts attention. It also attracts research. It also attracts many positive things that you wouldn't like to renounce to. I think the problem is when you use it vocationally, when you use it uncritically, when you think, okay, hyperpolyglot is this objective scientific category that has no shortcomings and that everybody should agree with. That I think is a problem. As long as you are aware of its shortcomings, you can use it strategically and effectively in society to convince other people to learn languages with you, etc. So that's the summary of my video. And the last reading we have for today is Tim Keely, who is a linguist. I think he lives in Japan, if I'm not mistaken. He specializes in Asian languages. And again, he touches up on a lot of the issues that I've already discussed in the case of Usman's papers or my own video, but he adds this. He adds a discussion of language difficulty. He says an important aspect when it comes to assessing who is the better hyperpolyglot or even who is a hyperpolyglot at all is the difficulty of each of the languages you speak. So, and here we talk about the similarity with the languages you already know and what is your first language. Again, it comes back to the thing that I already said, right? That if you speak Spanish as your first language and then you learn Catalan and Occitan and French and Portuguese and Italian, are you more of a hyperpolyglot than somebody who speaks Arabic, Japanese, Russian, Urdu, and Romanian, right? And so he posits this example, says hyperpolyglot A speaks these languages and hyperpolyglot B speaks those languages. So hyperpolyglot B speaks less languages, but they are less interrelated than the languages that hyperpolyglot A speaks. Hyperpolyglot A speaks 32 languages, some of which are much more related, like Croatian, Serbian, Macedonian, Bosnian, right? So then again, what criterion should prevail? That's the question. And that's pretty much it. That's pretty much it. And so the questions that I have for suggestion to kickstart our debate are these. Again, you may choose to touch or not to touch upon these. The first question is, what is or what should be the role of values, elitism, inclusivity, etc., in determining the benchmark, the cutoff for hyperpolyglotsia, in determining how many languages sanction the existence of a hyperpolyglot? That's the first question. The second question is, what is the best way to determine that benchmark, that cutoff, that magical number? And what role should difficulty play in it? The difficulty of the languages you're learning. And finally, how do we get rid of the stigma of elitism? Because this is a question that is not discussed in any of the readings, but I've come across it a lot of times. So Ariel Corén, for instance, was presenting on the notion of polyglot in the Fukuoka conference, Polyglot Conference. And she said that she asked people what they thought about the term polyglot, people who were not in the polyglot community. A lot of them said, oh, this is an elitist label. So if polyglot seemed to a lot of people to be an elitist label, what would they think of hyperpolyglot? Surely that is a very elitist, a hyper elitist label, right? So how do we get rid of that? How do we make people see that hyperpolyglotsia is not necessarily this bourgeois, accommodated, elitist mental game that we play amongst ourselves and we try to close off everybody else from playing? Those are the questions. And with that being said, we'll start the second part of this meeting, which is the debate. 90 minutes maximum. We don't need to be 90 minutes here, but if we want to, we can. And each person can speak an unlimited amount of times, but each intervention has to be limited to 5 minutes max, okay? But you can talk as many times as you want, but each time you talk for 5 minutes max, okay? Yep, yep. All right, let's get it then. Who wants to speak? Timothy, Tim.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me, Carlos?
Yeah.
Yes, great. Thanks very much for putting that together. I'll be very quick. You talked about how people perceive polyglottism, or am I using the word correctly? Polyglottism or hyperpolyglottism. And my question back to you is, what do we want to achieve by using the word hyperpolyglot? I mean, I can think that it may be nice for those who speak a lot of language to have a club of hyperpolyglots where we can share our experiences and feel at home with people with similar interests. Then there's the question of what promoting the label hyperpolyglot to a wider community. You're the hyperpolyglot activist. You want to sort of make a difference in by speaking lots of language. So what's not completely clear to me is, what do you want to achieve in society by using this label hyperpolyglot? That's all for me.
All right. Yeah, I'll respond because it was a direct question, and then I'll be very brief and then open the floor to everybody else. So I think we need to distinguish here between the term hyperpolyglot, which is the topic of this debate, and then projects that are around this term, like HYPIA or the hyperpolyglot activists, right? So the topic of this debate is hyperpolyglot. So what is the goal in using the term hyperpolyglot? I'll mention just two things. I think attention, it brings a lot of attention because it's a new term, it's a fancy term. People want to know what this is about. And there are more and more people behind HYPIA, the hyperpolyglot activists, etc. So it's a trending term, so attention. And then inspiration. I think that being a polyglot sounds great, but being a hyperpolyglot is like being a superhero. Who doesn't want to be a superhero, right? So I think attention and inspiration, these are two key things. Yeah. Well, what do everybody else think?
If I may.
Yep.
One of your points were how to get rid of the stigma of elitism. Yes, the last one, I think. But what you've just said is, well, creating this elitism a little bit, yes. If we want to make it fancy, which I agree, like it's a marketing technique for something good, in my opinion. I mean, like encouraging people to learn languages, yes. Totally agree with it. But we're creating a kind of, let's say, elite, and tell other people, come and join us, join the elite. And I think if we talk about elitism, we have to be very careful what we really mean by this. Because even in polyglot groups on Facebook, on social media, you can see people talking about monoglots as if they were worse kind of people.
Yeah.
They are strongly opposed. I teach people who struggle a lot to learn one first foreign language, but they're brilliant at their jobs, yes? They're wonderful people in their families. And it just happens for them that learning a language is not one of their priorities. For this or another reason, maybe they were never like really encouraged to this. Maybe they have bad experience with it. So I would say this term, hyperpolyglot, is a very good idea for marketing research. Not research, sorry, for marketing the idea. It can be a great term to name someone who speaks a lot of languages, but here is a very big question: what is a language? How to count? How to differentiate a polyglot and a hyperpolyglot? Because personally, like in this, in Tim Keely's presentation that you also covered, there is mentioned this too: Polish and Silesian. I'm Silesian. I speak Silesian, but I don't treat it as language. I know there is a huge debate, but I treat it, it's my Polish nationality expressed in the dialect. Although there's nothing different, there's no difference, like it's like grammatical or something between this and other people using the same variety, yes, not to call it like. There are many, many questions if we want to not only use it as a like kind of fancy term, but if we want to bring some, I don't know if I would use right now, like, let's say science into it. What you said, like numbers, what are the numbers meaning? Is it just to say that someone is eager to learn languages and an activist? Or is it there's something more? Because values, yes, they're great, but then it's just a marketing term, which can be great. I'm not saying that.
Who else wants to touch upon this?
Hello, can I speak a little?
Yeah.
Okay. Number one, if you say come to our elite, then in my opinion, it's not an elite anymore. I was an elite with 3 languages in Brazil because 80% of the people doesn't write and read really in Portuguese. So I don't mind this stuff. If I am elite or I'm not elite, I am a people who are a person. We are people who study languages. Okay. When it comes to fluency, I think it should be measured somehow, because if you compare a person who speaks hello, how are you in 10 languages with another who writes and reads fluently in 2, 3 others, there's some difference. So I suggest we should use something like B1 or B2 and discuss that. And I would define the term hyperpolyglot more in terms of achievement or academic knowledge than in terms of quantity of languages, etc. 6 languages for me, it's okay. But the most important for me is the characteristic that the person is a person focused upon the achievements in language and keeps using them for practical use. That's about.
Okay. Who wants to address this? So Victor talked about the coming to our lead being a little bit paradoxical, the setting the fluency level at B1, B2 level, and the value of achievement in determining who a hyperpolyglot is.
If I may, I would like to add something about how to measure the knowledge of many languages. I think the problem of many people is that, or schools, that they just measure how good you know the grammar. So this actually means you're a linguist and not a polyglot. So I think that measuring the knowledge of certain language should be based on what actually is knowing different languages by how good can you understand, how well can you speak, and then as addition also how well can you understand what is written, and also how good can you express yourself by writing. So I don't know, this is sort of my opinion. What do you guys think?
Right. So yeah, I mean, sorry, I was just going to say that a lot of proficiency exams are based on these four abilities, right? The ability to read, to write, to talk, and to listen. Who else wants to address what Anja just said?
May I step in?
Yep, Tim.
Thank you. Carlos, I'd first like to thank you for doing justice to my paper in terms of extracting the key points. And then your own work in that YouTube video was outstanding as well. And it's a wonderful synthesis you did. To Timothy's point, which builds on the discussion as it's going, what was the question was, what is the hyperpolyglot trying to achieve when she says she is so? I would extend that to say, what does HYPIA seek to achieve by saying it is an association of hyperpolyglots, so collectively? And so for Timothy, for you to share with you, community building was the primary ambition. So we speak in terms of elitism in this context, as in our conversation, as if it were power. But for many people, particularly before YouTube, this was a very lonely journey, learning languages alone. In your daily life, you couldn't find someone like you often. I'm speaking for myself here, but for many people pre-YouTube, it was very much a solitary thing. You couldn't really share it with people around you. In my current environment, I can. I mean, many people here speak 3, but it's multilingual. They just happen to, but they didn't work hard for it. So mutual support and encouragement through community was the primary ambition. Imagine I wouldn't say that that's elite. So HYPIA doesn't have an elite ethos. It's actually an anarchist organization, so it's very anti-elite in that sense. And the organizational structure of HYPIA is empowering that sense. So you just look at the degree of initiative and empowerment that each director has, like Carlos. Carlos is leading the charge today. He's the boss. And Matthias is the boss in many ways too. And so it's anarchist in that sense. So we don't see ourselves as us against those common folk, but actually it's those common folk are among us and they join us as one. And it's on merit. That's the key thing. So the elitism comes from merit. So you worked hard, you deserve it. That's why there's no money involved in this organization. The second, if I make just two more points. So that was the primary ambition, community building. But the second was language preservation. So rare language specialists came into it. That became a secondary thing, and it's actually quite an important part for us. And then research, as you see now, is the third. So this is how our ambitions have evolved. Thank you.
Thank you, Osman. It was awesome to hear such a brilliant synthesis of so many complex aspects of HYPIA that we've discussed throughout these months. And I just have one quick question. If merit is the main criteria upon which admission to HYPIA is based, what if someone who is intolerant but has the ability to speak 6 or more languages at a B1, B2 level wanted to be part of HYPIA? Would that be possible?
It would be in theory, but they wouldn't feel like they're a good fit because most of our conversation is so encouraging and inclusive and respectful. And so if they said, oh, I hate how these people are so nice to each other, it wouldn't really it wouldn't fit in.
But you would still admit the person or consider that person fit for HYPIA purposes?
Initially, because they passed the first test. Because everybody has different values. And Victor, you, Matthias, and I had this conversation privately once about, do you think it's more left-wing or you think it's more right-wing? And ultimately people came from a whole spectrum. So,
okay. Who else? Matthias?
My turn, okay. I took advantage to put in the Victor Lage de Araujo profile the subtitle Hyperpolyglot and HYPIA Scholar that it was lacking. Okay. Well, in my opinion, I think that when we talk about the team, what have said me a lot of times, Tim Keely in the last Polyglot conference about, okay, I have much more merit because I have learned languages from very different origins, from very different families. And for me, in my opinion, it has more merit to speak 6 languages from very different origins than 6 languages from at the very same related family. Okay, let me say you something. When I evaluated Ahmed Jaime Asarioch, the Spanish Moroccan, I realized that among his 18 languages, his 6 core languages, Berber, Tarifit, Arabic, Darija, Standard Arabic, English, French, and Spanish, the 6 of them, despite belonging to 2 or even 3 different, 2, 3 or different 4 different language families, he had the chance to learn them at a different stage of his childhood within his household or within the Moroccan educational system. I mean, what do I mean? The lack. What we do define as different language is the lack of intelligibility, not only the belonging to a very different family, because when at least you don't have a previous knowledge, a Spanish native speaker or a Spanish speaker of an L1 speaker cannot understand French at the first sight.
Mm-hmm.
And as somebody who speaks Spanish, French, Catalan, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, in addition to English, maybe it can be considered as a hyperpolyglot on a basis of the lack of intelligibility at first sight between those languages. And that's, I recognize that it's a matter of debate. And in that sense, HYPIA doesn't care if you have much merit or less merit in learning those languages. I mean, the point that can I speak can I speak at least 6 languages with 24 points at least, with recognized as such as different languages, politically and linguistically spoken. For example, regarding Serbo-Croatian as only one language, I mean, politically regarding as only one, and linguistically regarding as only one language. And regarding, I mean, 6 different languages as such. Well, I'm a hyperpolyglot. At least in my criteria, as long as it can be shown that there's a rupture in the communicability, or I mean, below 80% of intelligibility can be considered as such a rupture in communication. In that sense, it can stand as a separate language by their own. And if it can meet that criteria, and if it can be the second criteria, that to be recognized as a national language in the sense as a national entity or an official language with its own entity and its own corpus, it can be regarded as different languages, and thus 6 of them with 24 points can be considered as hyperpolyglot. That's it.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Matthias. Thank you for that distinction between a language belonging to a family and mutual intelligibility between languages. So we have 4 hands. If I'm not mistaken, first it was Timothy, then Jan, then Usman, and then Victor, right? In that order, you raise your hands, if I'm not mistaken. So, Tim?
Okay, very quickly, I want to say I agree with what Anya said, that, you know, these tests that you see are often not an accurate measure of linguistic ability. And when I say ability, I mean the ability to get things done in another language. I've had people in, you know, my research group at the university who can't pass an exam, but are very competent in English. The other thing I'd also point out are that also when you talk about a B1 level or B2 level or whatever, it can be extremely specific to what you're talking about. So for instance, in my field, in biomaterials research, many people I think would be B2 or C1 if they were talking about our field of research. But, you know, if you were talking about something that you wouldn't usually talk about, they would only be B1 or so. So, I mean, that also brings a question. If somebody can talk at a B2 or C1 level about something in their in a particular language, is that, you know, good enough for your standards? I mean, I appreciate I'm adding another level of complexity to another already complex question.
Okay, so the domain specificity of what you're talking about, not just your general ability of
exactly. I'm just saying it's even more complicated because you can be very good at talking about one subject, but rubbish about talking about another. You know?
Sure. As in biomaterials against medicine, for instance, or against
so I can talk about biomaterials in Polish with no problem at all, but I can't describe what you're wearing at all because I don't know anything about clothes.
Okay, all right. So Jan?
So I have to agree with what Timothy said and Anya. As a language teacher, I see there's a huge gap between what's the result of a test and what the student can actually do. I get students who are officially and tested as B2 level students, and then I try to talk with them about something, and there's nothing. So I have currently a student who lives in the US, and her tests show B2 level in English, but she has lessons with me because the conversation skills are very, very low for her. She struggles. She's a wonderful person You know, it's not a person who doesn't want to speak, who doesn't try. She just hasn't been taught maybe in a correct way or shown the way. So as it was mentioned, if we want to measure the level, it's a very, very complex problem. Again, I see it here as some people can speak informal language, and tests are very often in mixed language with the more accent on formal usage of the language. So if we ask a student to write a formal letter, this person might fail. I would say that many native speakers fail in writing formal text as they are seen at exams. If anyone has ever done a CAE exam or something like this in English, that's the most popular probably, they know one thing is what you write in an exam and the other thing is what you actually write on Amazon to a seller who haven't sent you the book, yes? So there are two things, and designing a good test is so hard a task, in my opinion, that we either have to agree on building a really complex way of testing somebody, or agree on doing, like, let's say, a test that shows it a little bit, and then trust the person, yes, or trust other sources for that. So that's about testing. It's also about the levels, as again Timothy said. The things that are tested on levels are, I don't know, food, clothes. For A1, A2, you have to know these things. And people can talk about astronomy because that's the fascination. And it's like, when I teach, why should I teach a person who I teach Polish, yes? The person lives in, I don't know where, South America. Why should I teach this person about, you know, everyday things that word is only used actually when you need to ask somebody to, when you're buying it in a shop? That's useless. There are so many other more important things in those, especially lower levels. So this is what I wanted to say about the structure. I think we would have to, about this testing, we would have to decide on one option: either do it really good, and that's a lot of effort, and prepare some kind of, you know, scheme for this, or a little bit accept the imperfect way of doing it. Thank you.
All right, great. So again, talking about how to test people's proficiency in a language, right, and the gap between people's abilities and the test results in that language. Usman is next.
Thank you, Carlos. To speak to Timothy and Jan's point, which is a very valid point, which Carlos typologizes domain specificity. It's true. So HYPIA allows you to play to your advantage when you apply, because we're mindful of this. So in the application, it asks you to talk about a subject of your choice. You choose. So it favors you, and that reflects the inclusive mindset. So when you choose, the ball is in your court. And so, yes, that means that you may exaggerate, but at least HYPIA is mindful that it's on your terms. To Jan's point just now, speaking in terms of writing. So out of the elements of language mastery that HYPIA looks at, speaking does dominate over reading, writing, and even listening, because community building is premised on writing. I mean, like, imagine you can have a community that's totally writing, like academic journals are, but organic community is premised on speaking, complemented by listening. So this was also our original faculty as humans. Reading and writing came later. So that's it. Two points. Thank you, Carlos.
All right, great, Usman. Thank you. Indeed, the community building aspect, and the fact that you can choose to speak your own being, as it were, to speak about your own domain. Great, Victor.
Okay. First of all, when you come to speaking 6 languages, I don't believe anybody who speaks 6 languages is unable to understand to other people's points. Perhaps it's too naive of me, but I only know hyperpolyglots linked to HYPIA, and all of them are very understanding. I don't believe somebody has understood 6 languages, and I've seen speaking, can't understand the point of view of another people. part of the thing. Okay, so I believe that our mission as hyperpolyglots is to what I call the anti-Babel effect. We are here to do anti-Babel. We are here to join people from other languages. This is our main achievement. When it comes to testing, I have put in the group my test of CIE, CPE, and those two are made in two sequences, one day after another, and they are not quite equal. Okay, Cambridge is the best tester in language probably, and they are using something called the item response theory that perhaps should guarantee that everybody that do the test and have the same result should have the same proficiency. But tests are not 100. It's impossible to do a test, 100% test. However, there are also the descriptors of each level ability, which is something you can do the test and then test in another way the achievements, like you go to a restaurant and ask for a menu, go to a street and ask for information. It's functional. The fluency is functional. You can't say you are fluent if you are going to do a job to tell your boss you speak very much, and then he asks you something in English you can't understand. It's not fluent. Finish time?
No. Just go ahead. I was going to ask a question, but I'll ask it afterwards. Okay, just some more aspect. If you're going to test the distance between the languages, if a hyperpolyglot speaks different or more or less different languages, then you have to study homology of languages. For instance, Russian and Ukrainian have about 60% homology. That means that 40% of the language is not common among both languages, and similar in Latin. So you can't deal with so much information unless we develop a computer test for that. Okay, no. Right. Okay. So that difficulty in analyzing similarities between languages. I wanted to ask you about the exact names of the tests you just mentioned, because I wasn't sure I had caught that part. If you could write it in the chat. I can send it. I made myself the test once on the same day. I made CIE and I made CPE, and so they both should do about the same result. But the results, the graphs are not quite the same. My results, one day after the other, no variation of language proficiency. Right. Results. I can they should have been the same, but they weren't the same, you're saying? They should have been the same, given that your proficiency was the same, but they weren't the same. Yeah, but actually I have better results in CPE. In CPE, I am almost C2 in everything. In CIE, I have even an ability which I was taken as B2. Right. Very, very different. Anja, I wanted to add something.
Yes, firstly, I wanted to say, I don't know, can you hear me? Because I can't see myself in the video.
Yes. So we can hear you.
Okay. I agree with Osman when he said that speaking and understanding are one of two most important skills, and also we teach children those two skills first. But of course, they're not valued enough. So the question is how to actually motivate people to start speaking, and how to show them that knowledge of speaking and understanding is also valued. Because mostly when they search for translators, people who know languages, they just want teachers who would teach grammar and again test students with how good they know grammar, and yet translators who just translate books, articles, who just writing skills, no speaking skills mostly. But to be honest, how well do you actually know your native language grammar? Because I know I can read the most complicated literature. I can write poetry in my language, but to be honest, I don't know very well my own language, my own native language grammar. So, you know, what is then the rule that I should know the foreign language if I don't even know my own language grammar? You know, just, I don't know. What do you guys think?
Jan wants to touch up on this?
Just quickly to add to what Anya said, it's about testing. Sometimes actually test the grammar or exercises, because you can get put verbs in the present perfect tense, or put nouns in this or that case, which checks that actually the student knows the case name or the tense name, knows how the form looks like. So it is possible to get high score on such an exercise without actually feeling the language. So in a real situation, knowing that this form should go in this context. On the other hand, when I teach, I saw that if you don't teach those things, but you just give enough examples to the students, they start feeling the language. You know, they're still, I would say, A1, and that's a question where the fluency starts. Because they are A1, they don't know the theory, but sometimes after like a minute of hesitation, it's like, I hate that guy, he asked me a question, I don't know which form I should use, and I use something, and this something turns out to be good. And so they somehow like really feel the language and not understand or know it like consciously. Is that fluency? What level is this? Because they lack a lot of words, but they're more fluent in sense of how fast they speak and what can they describe with a very limited number of grammar and words, but they can describe a lot. So that's a great question, and I wonder whether we can answer it here in only so many minutes.
There seems to be a difference on how conscious proficiency and fluency are respectively, right? Fluency, to a certain degree, it has been argued that it is the ability to speak without you consciously thinking about what you're going to say in each and every step. So in that sense, it is not entirely conscious, yeah. I have people wanting to speak, so let's go with Ruben now, and then I'll have a question for Usman. Ruben, you there? Ruben's not there. Matthias?
Yeah, hello. Hello,
okay.
Can you hear?
Yeah.
Okay, excuse me. Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much. I think the topic is really interesting. I also agree what also Victor said and mentioned before about if a person is enabled to speak and understand 6 languages, it's mostly probably that he will or she will learn very easily to understand and speak further languages. And definitely it's a really good question also for all of us to have a KPI. Which is the KPI, for example, as you mentioned, should we take 6 or should we take 8 or should we take 5? It's really a key point to figure out which is the right measure for that. And another point which I wanted to also to mention, what also I think Anya said before about should we also take into account teaching purposes or maybe academic purposes? Because if you also think about to write the research works like academic papers, also people who maybe has a knowledge very high writing academic papers in less languages or yeah. So maybe also some points also to figure out which I would say KPIs can we take into account additionally to the number of languages.
Yeah, that's a very interesting issue. Yeah.
Like also business purposes. So for example, also people who also are working as translators or using languages as a business regular use. Maybe they have a different topic, like also people who are using languages also for teaching purposes, grammar, where as an example, I can also give you an example about teachers mostly who are teaching English in Spain. So I will say it's not possible to learn English. So because they even don't, most of them, they even don't speak English. So just to give you an example, what kind of measures should we take or can we take?
Okay, great. Thank you, Ruben. So again, that domain specificity business or any other domain, and then also the genre specificity. So for instance, the academic paper, right? It's not about any particular domain, but there are certain conventions that we need to follow in order to write a successful academic paper. Usman, I didn't get your question, and now that you raise your hand, just state your point, please, and then we'll go to Matthias.
Thank you, Carlos. I wanted to second Victor's anti-Babel comment. The anti-Babel comment is a very true insight. So Carlos hypothesized hypothesized an intolerant person joining HYPIA. And I said they would pass. But I would like everybody here to think about like conceptualizing some intolerant, like a real intolerant person. Can you really imagine a truly intolerant person being a hyperpolyglot? So the truth is, I believe that we are all intolerant about different things. I have biases, we all do. But I think as a community, HYPIA's threshold for tolerance is much greater, or acceptability. We're at least open to another point of view, which is a point mentioned earlier by Victor. And I think it's more empathetic as an organization. So I think it's something to think about in terms of who is a hyperpolyglot and their values, given the discussion by Ruben just now as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think the ability to understand one point of view does not necessarily translate into being empathic with that person, right? So spies, for instance, they learn a lot of languages for the purpose of gathering intelligentsia. That doesn't, right? And many other political positions, but yeah. Matthias.
Carlitos, what do we measure in every language test? I will give you a very quick example. My speaking ability in Greek language is more or less halfway between A2 and B1, and however, I decided to take the A2 international exam. I went to Hellenic Foundation in Buenos Aires, May 30, 2019, and when I get examined, later, one week later, I failed. Why? Because the pedagogy graptulogo, I mean the written production, that define me as an A1 or at least as a not A2 just because I couldn't pass the written the written part of the test. No. What do I mean? As Usman said, HYPIA is mostly relying on speaking abilities. But there is another issue that's also very important, is about what can we define as fluency. As for example, if somebody knows the language at A1 or even A2 level, we are moving on common grounds in the sense of knowing the basic vocabulary and knowing all the grammar elements necessarily at A2 level in order to structure a speech. However, from B1 up, we all of us have different specific and more technical vocabulary. And my question is, what if I have, for example, what if I have an A2 level in general, but I have a very strong knowledge of a specific technical vocabulary, for example, sports journalism. I am very good at sports journalism here, for example. However, my general knowledge of language is A2. However, it must be defined as B1 or B2 due to my specific vocabulary, or an A2 because my general ground is A2. That's a very blurry line to what can we define as fluency if we are fluent in a specific area, or we can speak about every topic?
All right.
What,
yeah, the fluency in one area versus general.
with the rest?
Mm-hmm.
What happened with the rest? I cannot see the other 6 or 7. I only can
see them.
I'm here.
It changes the reality.
I think I touched some configuration, some setting about spotlight or something like that. Let me just figure it out. So one thing I would say, please, when you raise your hand and you finish your turn, you should lower your hand, because otherwise I don't know if you're raising your hand again or you which is you raising your hand and then not lowering it. You understand? So I see Timothy with his hand up, but I don't know if he's raised his hand or he just from the last time he rose his hand. Right?
Oh, it's a new question, but I promise to put my hand down when I finish. It's this is again connected with testing. I have the impression that everybody seems to be pleading for more flexibility in the interpretation of language levels for the purposes of entry. What I wanted to say was I have the impression. I mean, Jan, you're much more experienced with this, so maybe correct me if I'm wrong. But I have the impression that tests are designed for people who learn languages in a traditional way. So they go to group language courses and they learn in a structure that's determined by an external person, i.e. the teacher. Whereas I have the feeling that many polyglots will have learned some of their languages, at least in an independent manner, or which I think makes them poorer at doing sort of standard language tests, which are designed for people who don't aspire to be polyglots, who may have only learned 1 or 2 languages, and they may have learned it in a rather traditional way.
So, if I might quickly answer?
Yeah, just 1 second. Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
So what Timothy said and what we are discussing here, it's a huge problem because tests generally are designed to be objective. And it's super hard, as we can see from our discussion, to be objective. We need a test that would serve business. I mean, a company wants to hire a person who knows the language at a certain level because it works internationally in those countries. And there is no good answer, in my opinion. And as you, Timothy, said, yes, it is for standard courses. There are a lot of things I would disagree in language level descriptions. For example, as I think Victor mentioned, there's going to a restaurant. If I go to a restaurant, in most cases, I wouldn't bother about using even the native language. I can do it in English because, well, for me personally, going to a restaurant, it's not a big deal. If I learn German, I prefer to read a history book in German. I have this weird interest in DDR and this part of history, and that I understand. And I don't really care about what type of food is like named in with which words in German. Is it like Schwein oder nicht? That's not so important for me. So that's a problem with tests, and we will never, I think, find a solution here. We can find a working solution for HYPIA maybe.
Yeah, I agree that there's a certain margin that is hard to pin down, and there's always going to be controversy on how to test. Victor, did you have your hand raised?
Yes. Let's recap. I'm not asking for more flexibility on tests. I'm suggesting we have more objectivity on the determinations, because fluency and proficiency or whatever word, it's too vague a word. For instance, I know some persons who have C1, C2 in English, in German, who aren't fluent in the language because they are inhibited, they don't like to talk, etc. So they know the language, but they are not fluent. Tests like Cambridge, I did Cambridge, I did French, I did Spanish, and that they are all the same. I am C1 Spanish, C1 French, B2 German by test. I'm C2 German by course. But I didn't make it because of the pandemics. But the tests are the same. The tests now from Europe languages, they are standard. That means if I have, say, A2 abilities in French, that means I can go to a French restaurant and speak to a French clerk and obtain exactly what I know, what I want in French. If I have A2 in English, the same thing. If I have A2 in German, the same thing. So yes, of course, the tests are not precise. I've just sent my 2 tests to the group, but the tests are something and that they're much better than, oh, I'm fluent. Because how I'm fluent, I speak to Usman, I'm fluent. I speak to Johannes, I'm not fluent. I go to England, I don't know all the accents, and I'm not fluent anymore. To go to England and to make a master, I had to make C1, C2 because the language specifications required me to know audios in every most common accent, read texts in any subjects, be it mine or not, and so on. So the tests they are objective. Just a little something for Anja. I have asked to do the test in Portuguese by the testers of Brazil, and they told me it's not for me. I should not make the test in Portuguese, so I gave up. But I would like to. Okay, that's it.
It's Anya, not Anja. Anya.
What?
Yes.
Anya, okay. I thought it was Anja.
It's okay. I have been Anja, I have been Anka, I have been Anya. So
maybe Angel.
Yeah. I have been given all sort of names, but you know, I am just Anya. Just I think Slavic or Russian pronunciation is the best. Can I just add some question? Like you were mostly speaking about how the people are tested, but aren't actually tests made in school system to actually make a difference between a student? Just some of them have to pass and have the best results, and the rest of them should be lower. Isn't that the main point of testing at school system? So just the question you might want to answer or discuss.
Victor?
There are about 2 or 3 testing systems in English. But in Europe, for Europe languages, mostly they are using the CAFR testing, which is standard for all languages. And they are standardized comparatively for all language. That's why I like it, because what you do in Russian with A2 is the same that you do in English with A2. But in English, there are 2, 3 other systems. The link I sent you talks about that, but they are interchangeable. But also you can do a TOEFL test, you can do a CIE, CPE, etc., and they will be. You can have an equivalent results in terms of C2, C1, B1, B2 for each test. Thanks.
Right. So the European framework, Jan.
I think Usman was first.
Oh, was it? Sorry, Usman.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much. Jan, Anya, Timothy, Matthias, and Victor, they all collectively have raised a good discussion about controversy and selection, particularly testing. And we all struggle with this. I want to bring this in, the neoliberal paradigm of functionalism in society. So can you create value from language for the corporation? That's what it comes down to for many of the tests we do as adults. We're not in school anymore. Can we create value? So HYPIA is different in that sense. I think it's a good thing that it's not based on a utilitarian ideology, because community doesn't require utilitarian impositions. Nobody's asking you to create a value per se. It's community, it's organic, it's the fluid nature of life. Now, I want to add a little bit of controversy further. So I want to go back to Carlos's excellent presentation. Politics may determine language versus dialect. It may well do that, it's true. And Carlos cited Calveo's 1974 paper on that. Here's the thing I want to posit to you. For HYPIA, the challenge was, if we bunch these languages together, Serbo-Croatian, Bosnian, Macedonian, etc., what do you do? Here's the thing, not recognizing what some people consider their language is also a political act. If we didn't recognize the distinctions, then we would also be making a political decision. So if we reject what someone argued was their language identity, we would be inherently political in that sense. So the contours of HYPIA, the contours that we follow, are those that are acceptable to the political structures as perceived by people. So Serbian, Macedonian, Bosnian are different because the people say they're different. And in that context, one more thing is that we focus on the over-determination of separating language and dialect. We always say, you know, but it's an army thing. Yes, but we don't focus on the over-determination of sticking together languages. The act that we say that, oh, you're all kind of the same to me. That's the same as saying all you people look alike to me. It is a subtext of racism. That, you people are kind of the same. So we have to strike that balance of not being political on either end. Thank you.
Yeah, Usman, but
remember that Macedonian and Slovene are two different. There are separate languages, but Serbo-Croatian is the same.
Yeah, these two are different. Just before opening the floor to Jan, just what Jan said, right? He said, okay, Polish, Silesian, I see a different identity, but I don't recognize a different language. So my perspective is that you never get out of politics in language. So you cannot choose a non-political stance on language. You can just be transparent about the political values that drive your language differentiation.
Very true.
Jan?
Okay, so just to quickly refer to what Usman said, I think that maybe just the idea of using the word language nowadays is not the best. A variation to get rid of, the question dialect, language, because as you said, so if a person comes with 6 languages, 2 of them being Polish and Silesian, and another person comes and says, I have only 5 because I can speak perfect Polish and Silesian, but Silesian is a dialect for me. How would that be seen? I don't want to name my dialect a separate language, but I still know the variety as good as others. But that's just to this. As far as utilitarianism is concerned, Usman, I think you well said that, very often we think it as something for a corporation, but generally a language is a utilitarian because just the act of communication is, this is the use of language. And I had a student who said something like this: I don't want to speak perfect English. I want to speak English like an Italian. But the problem was that because she heard someone on the radio and this person could also speak. The problem was for her, so she thought that she can lower her own standards so low that she would communicate in any way. And then everything she produced was a bunch of words that didn't have much sense together. But that's a good question for testing. Yes, maybe we should test utilitarianism. How we use the language. Are we able to communicate our thoughts, our ideas? But what we focus here a lot is about finding a level of a language, and to just go outside a little bit of this. As we have language continuum, yes, there's very often there's no strict border between what we call 2 languages, yes, commonly. Maybe we should see ourselves as language learners just being humble people on this way, somewhere on this way. In some aspects, C2, yes, in some other A1. If you're a person with Asperger's syndrome, you probably don't like talking to other people. Small talk is something you cannot do very easily. You can elaborate for hours about, I don't know, quantum physics in 5 foreign languages without any problems. There's 10. But when you're faced with saying hello to somebody and just talking about the weather and yesterday's football match, well, it can be bigger a challenge than this whole quantum physics things. So maybe some thought of this should be also included. Are you a person who wants to be on a way in learning a language? And maybe that's what the difference with multilingual, a person who is multilingual, who happens to know. It's just because I was raised in Switzerland, yes? And that's like normal, everyone speaks that. I don't care. But if I care, there's a kind of significant difference maybe.
All right, great. Great many points, as I said in the chat, particularly the language variation. I agree so much. Like, no languages, no dialects, just language variation. Victor, Anya, Victor. I don't know who was first. Do you know?
It is first.
All right, Anya.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I have a question for Usman. I read your name right, or I said your name right?
It's actually Usman. That's the perfect way to say it.
Okay, so people who qualify that they know Serbo-Croatian, Bosnian-Herzegovinian, Montenegrin language or languages, this is qualified as one language or 3 languages, 4 languages, because if it's qualified as 3 or 4 languages, then half of Slovenia qualifies for HYPIA as well. So how can you define either this is 1 language or 3, and if they can, half of Slovenia can be accepted in HYPIA or not?
Yeah, perfect question. And ironically, you will see a lot of cynicism among people from the former Yugoslavia. So they themselves will say, well, you know, that's my 6th, 7th, and 8th. But they generally do have a 1 to 5 as well. And so we haven't confronted that problem seriously, in the sense that there was nobody who spoke just 6 former Yugoslav languages, and that's it, let me in. We haven't had that, because the people themselves have a bit of cynicism about this. So it kind of balances out.
Okay.
Well,
Just
for
clarification
purposes, American and British English is the same language, but Mandarin and Cantonese are different languages.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. And I don't know what you think, but as a British person, I've always been surprised that people who don't speak English as a first language make a big deal out of British and American English, to be honest. I mean, can they be even considered as dialects? I'm just curious, since you brought up the question.
It's like Portuguese, Portugal, Portuguese Angola, Portuguese Brazil. It's much the same.
What's your point, Victor?
Translate.
So, just a comment. We have seen news. This is for Johannes. I believe he's the one who talked about that. We have been living a political language problem in Belarus, and in Brazil they are considering, they're forcing us to change the name of the nation, because it was Belarusia, and now they want to be Belarus. They are fighting for a white versus red banner. This is politics and language. Language got in the way. But about the question, dialects and variety, I think the key to consider a dialect far or not far from a language would be homology. This has been studied by most languages. Homology and grammar homology and lexical homology, that can be found, I believe, for most languages. And okay. We are on our way to learning language. For me, the key to a hyperpolyglot is that phrase: we are on our way to learning languages.
The journey, not the destination. Did somebody say something on the chat? I'm also interested in how you can count Arabic. Counting Arabic. Many linguists say the dialects are in most cases different languages in relation to MSA, Modern Standard Arabic, or not. Okay. Does anybody want to express their opinion on Modern Standard Arabic versus quote unquote dialects of Arabic?
I don't know the language, so I can't.
I think you could consider it methodological. Because if you consider in other facts, it would be subjective. If you consider this language has 50% homology with this other, or vice versa, or 80, 90, that's something we can touch. This country has 300 languages. So people at India are naturally polyglots. Hyperpolyglots. Okay, that's something different.
And I think there's also a parallel with the former Yugoslav languages, that if somebody applied to HYPIA and they just had 6 versions of Arabic, I think it would be a little bit of a, hey, give it a rest. But if it's complemented by other things, then yes. So, and that's how we usually get it. Somebody may say, I do speak Moroccan, but then Modern Standard. All right, but if it's just 6 kinds of Arabic, okay, no thanks, right?
All right, so I think that this is the point where we can move to the next topic, if everybody agrees. Is that correct?
Okay.
Yeah, okay,
Yes.
so next topic, choosing the next topic. Let me read the instructions and then we'll move on. So a number of choices will be presented by the director of research, aka me, based on the research preferences and interests expressed by all HYPIA research members. This is true. I've actually done this. A voting will take place to decide the topic today, okay, now, followed by the self-nomination, meaning you should volunteer, the self-nomination of one or more HYPIA research members to carry out the initial presentation on the topic. So I'm not going to be making the initial presentation every meeting. Each one of us should do the initial presentation in each meeting, right? That's the idea. So the presenter will be in charge of selecting the readings. I will not select the readings. The next presenter will select the readings, although each of us may suggest, oh, I read this interesting piece. Could you please suggest this for reading? But in the end, the presenter decides. And you can choose from HYPIA's working papers, the Hyperpolyglot activist videos, or any other relevant material. And you communicate them by email or WhatsApp at least a week before the seminar. Really important, okay? Because we want to be able to go through the whole material before the meeting, right? With enough days in advance. So with that in mind, we'll see a list of topics based on your stated preferences. Then we'll vote. Then we'll decide the presenter. And then the presenter will be in charge of selecting the readings and communicating them a week before the meeting. Yep. Okay, so let's go.